Israeli forces say they killed a local Hamas commander in the occupied West Bank today. Hamas confirmed the killing in a separate statement. It's part of a major operation in the West Bank that Israel says is necessary to eliminate threats from Hamas and other militant groups in the region. But the UN is warning against escalation of the war, saying the humanitarian situation is dire, with tens of thousands of Palestinians in 4 refugee camps already impacted by the operation, which is now in its third day. ABC News foreign correspondent Britt Clennett joins me now from Jerusalem. And Britt, give us the latest on the situation there with the Israeli operation in the West Bank.
Well, Eva, what we have experienced over the last 2 days has been quite astonishing. Although the operation is now in its 3rd day, on the first day we witnessed a strong military presence in a village called Bet Rima. We saw locals throwing rocks at IDF jeeps. We saw soldiers walk down the roads pointing their guns at storefronts. And we spoke to a resident who said that the operations had been going since 4 a.m. that morning and that they were still on. And we were speaking to him around 8 p.m., 7:30, 8 p.m. that night, and he said, of course, they're still here. So there is a whole lot of hostility. And then yesterday, we were at Farah camp, which is basically one of the camps that endured a 30-hour raid. Now, let's remember, this is one of the biggest IDF raid operation that we've seen since 2002. The place was destroyed in many parts. You know, you'd walk along the main road and it was just gutted out by bulldozers. We saw puck marks from bullets all along the sides. A medic told me that he treated dozens of wounds, but many gun wounds. He said that he actually couldn't get people to the hospitals because the whole camp had been sealed off by IDF forces.
Israeli forces have killed at least 12 people in the West Bank so far, and the UN says that Israel is, quote, fueling an already explosive situation there. How does this operation affect the larger war and the prospect of a ceasefire deal?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing, you know, that we've learned, especially speaking to people, is the fear that this could be a third front in the war. We have Gaza. We know that tensions are high with Hezbollah on the northern border. And the fear is that the war in Gaza could spread to the West Bank. And I think for Palestinians, the parallels are not lost on them. As for ceasefire talks, well, it's definitely not going to help discussions. But, you know, speaking frankly, it doesn't look like those are making much headway anyway. You know, discussions are underway. We know that mediators are trying their best to keep those talks alive. But what we do know is that Hamas does not accept the idea that there will be any military presence in Gaza. And that is one of their red lines that Israel is insisting on.
Britt, a massive polio vaccination campaign is about to begin this Sunday for children in Gaza. What's the latest on that?
So this is good news. 650,000 children need this vaccine. It will be rolled out in 3 stages. It is a limited pause, I must stress, and it's only in designated areas. But it is welcome news for those people in those extremely dense areas who are living in filthy conditions and fear the spread of disease. But this is something that aid groups have been really begging for weeks, and they fear that polio is just the start, that with these conditions and people being squeezed into small humanitarian areas, that more diseases will spread, Eva.
ABC's Britt Clennett, thank you so much for joining us, Britt. For more on this, let's bring in Ishan Tharoor. He's the international affairs columnist for the Washington Post and has been following these developments closely. Thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with, you know, operation is Israel's largest incursion into the West Bank in years. We heard Britt talking about that. What is Israel's end game there?
Good to be with you, Eva. You know, it's important to remember that before the events of October 7th, when Hamas carried out its hideous terror attack on southern Israel, the real theater of operations and of concern among policymakers, activists, NGOs, and so forth was the West Bank. You'd seen a growing amount of militancy in Jenin in particular and certain other parts of the territory. You'd seen a a settler movement, an Israeli settler movement in the West Bank, emboldened by the country's far-right government, carry out all sorts of attacks and provocations on Palestinians living in their midst. And so there was a sense well before October 7th that things were getting worse. They were reaching a boiling point. There was a fear of growing militancy in Jenin and in these other areas. And then, of course, since October 7th, there's been a massive uptick in violence and Israeli strikes. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank since October 7th, although, of course, our focus has principally been on the astonishing devastation of Gaza during this time. And this move, which is, of course, the biggest set of operations outside of Gaza that Israel's carried out since October 7th, is a reflection of immediate Israeli security concerns about certain militant cells operating in the West Bank, but also a reflection of a desire among the Israeli leadership to really put the foot down on Palestinians, and this is a continuation of that.
The Israeli delegation left Qatar today with no progress being made on ceasefire talks. Do you see any cause for optimism going forward there?
At this point, I'm afraid I don't think so. The consensus, and this is what you hear from U.S. officials, Arab officials, even some Israeli interlocutors, is that this current government, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, is not particularly interested in a ceasefire along the terms certainly that Hamas would want. It wants to maintain an element of de facto control or military control over parts of Gaza. It wants to reserve the right to resume hostilities in the medium term. And that for Hamas is a non-starter. And so we're seeing this continuing evisceration of Gaza as a territory and continuing Israeli strikes and continuing violence.
We heard Brett mention this concern about the war on three fronts. Right now, Israel's fighting on three fronts, in Gaza, southern Lebanon, and the West Bank. Is this sustainable for Israel? Do you see this escalating into some sort of wider regional war?
I mean, that's the big question. And you know, U.S. officials who you talk to are desperate that this does not explode into conflagration. They've spent a lot of their energies in recent months trying to ensure that Israel's actions, as much as the U.S. supports them, don't trigger a spiral of escalation. And I think in the most recent flare-up with Iran, we saw that fears over escalation there have not come to pass. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that within Israel, there is a very emboldened far-right movement that is up in arms since October 7th, and that really wants to see much tougher action on the perceived enemies in Israel's midst.
Ishan Tharoor of The Washington Post, thank you so much for your analysis.
Good to be with you.